要正式开始了。那还没有就座的话，还没有就座的嘉宾可以进行就座哦。我们今天也有准备了一点茶点跟点心。那在我们的吧台区，然后大家都可以自由做取用。然后我们的洗手间的话，则是我们吧台区旁边冰箱旁边有贴着一个 WC 的标志，进去之后右手边就是我们的洗手间了。如果要去使用的话，我们洗手间在那个方向，谢谢。好，那我们活动就正式开始。好，大家好。好。好，欢迎各位来到 TempoX Accelerator and Co-working Space。我是 TempoX 加速器生态的主理人，我是 Mike。TempoX 是我们东区 BlockTempo 于去年底刚成立的 Web3 新创生态加速器 and 共享办公空间。今天是个特别的日子，在我们第一场 Plurality Salon 积沙成岛多元民主的台湾经验如何推进到 Web3 时代。在这场活动中，我们很高兴可以邀请到3位千里迢迢远道而来的嘉宾，那同时也是 Plurality 主要的倡议者，包括激进市场的作者 Glen Weyl， 以及谢谢 Glen。以及以太坊的共同创办人 Vitalik Buterin， 还有 Puja O'Hara 一同降临在 TempoX。Welcome Puja， 一同降临在我们的 TempoX， 一起畅谈 Plurality 多元宇宙。那在进入到我们的主题之前呢，想先跟各位分享一个小故事。大家可以看到我们这次活动的主视觉。那这次主视觉呢，就是利用我们 Plurality Book 里面的玉山视野的章节所做成的。这边的文字全部都是 Plurality Book 里面玉山视野的真实章节的真实内容。那这次我们的活动主题是积沙成岛嘛，就是希望说象征着大家一起把文字给堆砌起来，然后来形成一个 Plurality 多元协作的一个概念。然后在进入到我们的主题之前，我也想跟各位好好介绍一下 TempoX。TempoX 致力于串联公有店、社群、亚洲顶级 VC、交易所、大型项目、KOL 等产业的关键领导者，像是 Animoca 还有 Tang Foundation 等世界级的生态资源所成立的 Web3 新创加速器和共享办公空间。我们筹备了近1年，那是在去年底，就是上个月中的时候刚刚开幕。那为什么我们要成立 TempoX 呢？因为其实我们看到台湾其实一直在技术还有在人才上具有领先的优势，可是，在区块链产业发展到1.4兆美元规模的今天，却鲜少在国际 Web3 市场的主导者中看到台湾新创的影子。那我们的成立是为了要去建立一套更有效率的寻找国际资金、组建人才以及发展 Web3 生态的营运策略。那我们希望能将东区过去7年所积累的这些厚实的力量聚集在 TempoX。那不仅提供一个实体空间，让新创团队可以进行交流，那更为新创团队提供成长上必要的技术、资金还有市场资源，来助推台湾人才走向国际视野。那我们的空间目前驻扎着许多非常优秀、来自不同领域的顶级团队，那像是有 JZ Invest， 还有 Freever 跟 TempoX Studio， 还有 Tang Foundation， 以及享誉国际的 Digital Artist 吴哲宇。那我们期许 TempoX 从这个能看到这个无边无际台北市难得的这个天际线的这个空间，那带领台湾的这些优秀的新创团队，可以在这个无边无际的国际 Web3 市场中脱颖而出，占领一席之地。那待会活动中的空档欢迎各位去我们的露台走走。那在我们后方的那个露台， 那是可以看到台北101跨年烟火的海景第一排，然后在我后方的这个露台呢，则是可以看到台湾最具指标性的中正纪念堂以及台北车站还有阳明山。那今天的 Plurality 是这一趟 Journey 的起点。那未来我们将会每月举办线下的 Plurality 的读书会，以及在今年的8月6号到8月8号之间，在台北的南港展览馆2馆，我们会去举办 Plurality Summit ABS 2024。那现在也请我们 Asia Blockchain Summit ABS 的 CEO Andrew 来替我们介绍一下今年的 ABS 还有 Plurality Summit。那我们欢迎 Andrew。
Hello everyone, thanks for taking the time to come here to provide some great seeing you all. Fantastic full days with Glen, Vitalik, Puja, amazing time together. So we're hosting the iconic Tango and Taipei debate between Dr. Jun Norabini and BMX Arthur Hayes to witnessing astronaut Chris Hadfield historic Bitcoin transaction via blockchain satellite. Asia Blockchain Summit has been an annual event that brings together leading innovators, experts, and enthusiasts in blockchain and cryptocurrency industries. They haven't taken a hiatus since 2020. We're super thrilled to announce that Asia Blockchain Summit is finally coming back in August 6th and 8th in Taipei, Taiwan. And special thanks to Glen Weyl and the Plurality team. We will also be co-hosting Plurality Summit 2024 along with ABS. And we do have a special gift for all the attendees for this event, so we'll keep that surprise till later. But I look forward to having a good chat with y'all, and I look forward to this amazing session together. Yay!
谢谢 Andrew 的介绍。As Andrew says, we do have a little surprise for everyone. That is Plurality Salon Telegram Group. We 欢迎各位加入到我们的这个 Telegram 的群组里面，然后填写这个群组里面的表单，留下 ETS 地址。那我们将会空投，就是这次 Plurality Summit ABS 2024 NFT 的 ticket。给大家一点时间扫一下。那在我们不断的提到 Plurality， 但 Plurality 到底是什么样子的一个概念？在活动开始前，我们很高兴能够邀请到动区 BlockTempo 的主编胖丁，然后来当我们活动的引言人。那顺便跟大家分享、介绍一下 Plurality。让我们欢迎胖丁之前呢。如果今天你们有任何的问题想要问Glen、Vitalik 或者是 Puja 或者是 Andrew， 那或者是说在讨论中就是有什么样的 topic， 那都可以进入到我们扫描我们的 QR code， 进入我们的 Slido， 留下你们的问题，那我们会进行及时的整理跟搜集还有反馈，然后在 Q&A 时间的时候我们可以协助提出。好，再给大家5秒钟扫。好，那就正式欢迎我们的活动的引言人，我们欢迎胖丁。
Hello， 大家好，我是 BlockTempo 主编胖丁 GK Pop。然后今天很荣幸邀请到 Glen 还有 Vitalik 还有 Puja 一起来到TempoX一起帮我推广 Plurality。那我想要告诉大家 Plurality 是什么 ？Plurality 其实是一个用科技还有分析技术，然后一起促进民主协作协作一个方式。然后台湾呢是一个有很多 Plurality 经验的地方。这呼应到我们今天的主题，我们这样活动叫积沙成岛。那我觉得每个人都像是一粒沙子这样子。那我们透过多元协作和分散式协作的方式，把它聚在一起，形成台湾这块岛屿的民主以及精神。然后比如说民主学运的一些背后的资料的调度，以及疫情时间的一些口罩地图。而且刚刚台湾也刚选举完嘛，我们不要讲那个Web3，其实一些媒体或者是他们自己在 算那些票数的时候，也是用这种多元协作，可能就上 Google Document 上面记录这样的东西。所以其实这些东西呢，我们生活当中都可以看得到。那我们发给各位手上的卡片跟我们今天主视觉呢，是预算视野的英文的部分。那我讲一下这个，我们设计成一个大树的样子，就是我们希望呢，可以在台湾这个 island 上面呢，我们截取大家的多元协作的一个经验，然后我们去这样养分，最后我们成为一个 Plurality 大树这样子，这是一个这样的概念。我们想传递给大家，原来透过多元协作，我们可以诞生出很棒的一个新的东西。然后这场活动主办的一个原因呢，是由 Glen 1月8号的时候来到在飞地书店西门町那个书店，他办了一场读书会。那场读书会我没有办法到那边，但是呢 ，Plurality 强调是谢谢你的精神，所以其实我在那一天我就自己看了一下那一天的读书会的那些记录的东西，然后我就看到Audrey Tang Plurality也编辑了那份东西，所以我看完了这个东西之后，我觉得哇好棒哦，原来这就是 Plurality 的精神。我不用本人在那个会场，可是我看到大家协作的成果，然后我学到了很多东西。然后我希望今天这场活动也会是那场读书会的延续，然后我们可以把很多那一天1月8号的感动，然后带到今天现场，传到各位的脑海里，然后我们一起想怎么样成就这片多元宇宙的未来。对，然后我自己分享一下我阅读 Plurality 的一个感想。因为很多人认为 Plurality 其实是一个很难的东西啊，想说，什么民主社会啊，数位民主这到底是什么东西？但是我觉得这东西一点都不难。我讲一下这跟一般的民众生活有什么关系哦。比如说，我就在讲我13年前、12年前我在读清华大学的时候，我很喜欢玩一款游戏叫 Minecraft。然后 Minecraft 呢，那时候大家玩 Minecraft 的方式呢，是去 GitHub 上面下载那个 map 这些档案下来，我们就可以玩很多这样的东西。那我自己的寝室呢，跟我们那栋宿舍的人也很喜欢 Minecraft 不好意思。Minecraft， 然后所以我们那个时候呢，自己做了一张地图上在 GitHub 上，然后我们去宿舍告大家，大家可以进来我们这伺服器玩啊。对，那这个是不是多元协作？我想是的。那我们做这个多元协作的目的是为了什么？是为了我们想要赚钱吗？当然不是。所以我们其实是为了我们自己个人的利益，我们想要分享这样的快乐，我们去做这样的地图，但是我们却无意间就是贡献了这种吸引的这种成品出来。所以呢，我想这也是Plurality 在探讨资本主义社会中，我们可以用区块链技术做一些什么样的努力。那我自己的个人对 Plurality 的理解是，他找到了一个在资本主义当中可能新的一条道路。对，比如说呢，像我刚刚讲，我因为自私自利嘛，我想要让全宿舍的人跟我一起玩那个 Minecraft 的地图，这是我自私自利的过程。但是它无形中形成的一个机制，你看我愿意去推广这种实际零的东西。对，所以呢，我用一句话总结就是呢，我觉得 Plurality 可能最后在资本主义上的一个道路，可能是我们设计出一个机制，我们基于自私自利的贡献，但是我们却意外的推进公共财的产出，最后形成民主的一部分。然后也希望这样子的东西机制如果出来的话，我们也可以让它变成这个 Plurality 参天大树的养分。当然也希望今天 Plurality 的活动顺利，谢谢大家。
谢谢胖丁讲得非常的精彩，然后我们接下来就正式进入到我们活动的环节。那首先我们进入到第一个 agenda， 是由我们的 Audrey， 虽然 Audrey 人不在现场，但是 Audrey 有先 recording 一段她的 video 在讲 Plurality 的，然后希望说也可以让大家了解一下 Audrey 她对 Plurality 的想法。好，下面就播放。
Good local time. I'm Audrey Tang, co-author of Plurality, the future of collaborative technology and democracy. It is a real pleasure celebrating the collaborative capacity at the heart of Plurality. It is a real pleasure. The local time. I'm Audrey Tang, co-author of Plurality, the future of collaborative technology and democracy. It is a real pleasure to participate in this important event, celebrating the collaborative diversity at the heart of plurality. In the 1960s, the Internet as we know it began to take shape, heralding the dawn of a new era defined by hope, ideals, and change. By the 1990s, it became a major driving force, and each of us participated in the transformation. Today, there is one question on the tip of our collective tongues. In the face of technological singularity, how can we open new dimensions and free the future? The truth of the matter is democracy is under threat, especially from authoritarians attempting to use AI to undermine and weaken our foundation of trust. Internet freedom declined for the 13th consecutive year, according to the Venerable Freedom House. Today, only 1 billion people live under democratic systems, while more than twice that number toil under authoritarian rule. As mentioned in the prologue of the book, the concept of plurality symbolizes the symbiosis of democracy and collaborative technology. Facing the challenge of democratic backsliding, we can weave a fresh foundation of mutual trust, cherished by all, and revitalizing democracy along the way. We are pursuing this new model in Taiwan, where 数位 stands for digital and plural, connecting communities while enabling knowledge to permeate across languages and cultures. This October, UNIGF Kyoto highlighted global expectations for digital equality and empowerment. At the event, I shared Taiwan's innovative model of digital democracy amid the growing chorus of cross-sectoral support for AI democratization, in partnership with the Collective Intelligence Project, OpenAI, Anthropic, and the Getting Plurality Research Network. Now take a look at this. Every dot represents an opinion and sparkles like a star in the darkness of the background. The holistic reflections form constellations, providing us directions on alignment. For many participants, this is the first time they interacted with AI in the context of deliberation, not as a solo conversation, but as an evolving group discussion for the collective good. Augmented deliberations like this means anybody and everybody can become a contributor and beneficiary of digital democracy. This leads to improved societal resilience, enhancing information integrity, while deepening cross-cultural understanding and empathy. Built upon open source tools, they are not limited to the interest of a single party. Instead, they are designed collaboratively, promoting the interconnectedness of collective intelligence. From ancient Greece to the 21st century, humanity experienced a transition from nomadic to agrarian and then to industrial societies. Yet, the ideal of direct democracy has not completely disappeared. Through plurality, we are rediscovering the communal spirit of reciprocity on a higher plane. Indeed, collaboration on the basis of shared values goes beyond delivering solutions solely to our local communities. By participating in societal evaluations, measurements, and mitigations to common risks and harms, we can build a foundation of mutual trust, paving the way forward to a shared future. The bottom line is when it comes to the Internet, there are no geographical boundaries, only the proximity of values. Faced with the rapid advancement of technology and the polarization intensified by globalization, the time is ripe for us to double down on plurality. Through interoperable coexistence, we're achieving something impactful and significant: collaborative diversity. In closing, let me offer a prayer. When we see the Internet of Things, let's make it an Internet of beings. When we see virtual reality, let's make it a shared reality. When we see machine learning, let's make it collaborative learning. When we see user experience, Let's make it about human experience. And whenever we hear that the singularity is near, let us always remember the plurality is here. Thank you for your kind and generous attention. Live long and prosper. Using machine learning, let's make it. Thank you for your kind and generous attention. Live long and prosper.
Yeah, thank you, Audrey. And actually, we are doing a collaborative learning right now. And Plurality is here. 现在呢，就让我们进入到我们今天的第二个主要议程，就是大家万众瞩目的，我们欢迎我们激进市场 Radical Markets 的作者，让我们欢迎 Glen Weyl。
Great, thank you so much.
I have to say this visit to Taiwan. Oh, do you want to go? Oh, yeah. Great. Should I use the mic or wait?
Yes.
Okay.
Just keep distancing now. Mike's,
Okay.
It's good now. Good to go.
Okay. I have to say this visit to Taiwan has really been the brightest light of my career so far. It has just been so wonderful to be with all of you, to see everything that's being accomplished here, to connect with all the possibilities that are available here. And this is a perfect capstone to this incredible visit. And it's so wonderful as well to have my friends like Vitalik and Puja here with me for one of the first times, to be with Audrey, to be with my family who are off at daycare now. So it's just, thank you so much for being such wonderful hosts for us. Today, as you've heard ad nauseum, I want to tell you about plurality, but maybe you've heard a little bit more about the word and the buzz than about the substance. So I want to try to walk you through what we mean a little bit. This is a project that, as Audrey pointed out, derives from the fact that Shu Wei means both digital and plural, both a social philosophy of collaboration across difference and a technological direction employing digital technology. And plurality is our attempt to render this into English. And we're not doing it alone, we're doing it with a community of hundreds of people around the world, including some of the people you see on these slides. And you'll see many people who are in the audience today, both from Taiwan and around the world there. And what we're responding to is the conflict that many people in the West feel between technology and democracy, where technology is viewed as undermining the information environment, creating polarization, and thereby subverting the democratic processes in many countries. And many in the tech industry feel that technology is under assault from democracy as well. What you hear about in democratic politics is overwhelmingly the problems created by technologies, how to regulate and constrain it. You see the investment that democratic governments are making in R&D dramatically declining as a share of GDP. And at the same time, many more authoritarian regimes are embracing technology. They're building advanced cities. They're creating places to experiment with new tools. And we believe that this sense of a conflict between democracy and technology arises because of the stories that we've been telling and the directions we've been pursuing for the future of technology. And the two that I think most dominate the way we talk about technology are ones deriving from the game Civilization VI, the best-selling strategy game of all time, are synthetic technocracy, or basically the story that you often hear that there's going to be a giant machine, it will do everything for you, you'll get a universal basic income and can just have fun. So that's like, one very common story you hear about the future of technology. Another one, which is closely associated with people like Peter Thiel, Balaji Srinivasan, Mark Andreessen, is that technology will undermine the ability of collective organizations like governments, labor unions, etc., to keep track of anything. Cryptography and blockchains will instead, force everything into a space of market-driven, hyper-capitalist, snow crash style organization with tons of individual privacy. And we believe that actually most of the technologies we use today were actually driven by a different perspective, but one that we don't talk about enough or as clearly. I think that those ideas underlie things like Star Trek and the internet, but are perhaps not as clearly articulated in the common tech discourse. But they are familiar here in Taiwan. Things like Gov0, the civil movement, V-Taiwan, built in partnership with the government early, led by people like Audrey's predecessor, Jacqueline Tsai, who we're very lucky to have in the audience today, helped Taiwan deal with environmental issues, with the infodemic, with the pandemic. And there's a wonderful story to tell around these through the story of Audrey, who became the first Minister of Digital Affairs, rising from something that could have been just a horrific and traumatic social conflict. The people in the United States occupied our national legislature for 3 hours. It was more than 100 times as long here. And yet, rather than coming out of that into division and hatred, they rose out of it into a place of pushing technology and our ability to cooperate forward. And Audrey has taken action on this. And as you heard, I won't read her poem again, she speaks this in poetry. But to scale things, to move beyond the context, to build on them, people also need to hear prose. And that's why we're writing this book, Plurality, the Future of Collaborative Technology and Democracy. As Audrey said, plurality is defined as technology for collaboration across social differences. And the reason why you constantly see us giving the Vulcan salute is that this is partly derived from the Vulcan philosophy in Star Trek of infinite diversity and infinite combinations. The idea that all truth, beauty, and progress come from the union of the unlike, as symbolized by this triangle inside of a circle giving birth to this diamond. And one way I like to give a physical analogy to this is to say, some people, when they see explosions, they want to tamp them down. Other people say there's oil underneath the ground, right? And that's how we look at social conflict. Anywhere there's social conflict, if we build the right engine, we can harness that social conflict to push society forward, to innovate, and to create progress. And we believe that the foundation of this is at the intersection of the way that human rights are the foundation of democratic systems, and operating systems are the foundations of how digital environments work. And we believe internet protocols, which are that sort of common operating system that instantiates our rights in the digital realm, are the equivalent for the digital age of both the of the interconnected digital age of both the operating system and human rights. And that the fundamental problem we have is that the internet protocols, those open interoperable protocols, stopped with basic communication protocols, rather than extending, as they'd originally been envisioned by the internet's founders that Audrey was mentioning, to things like personhood and identity, association, privacy, and publicity, the sharing of digital assets, and commerce. And we believe that if those are built as that base layer, then on top of it, we can create applications that achieve this idea of plurality. Again, plurality is cooperation across social difference. And that is a little bit of a tension, right? Because of course, it's easier to cooperate deeply with people who are more similar to you with a small number of people. And it's easier if you want to reach a large number of people to cooperate in just very thin ways. And that's why there's a whole range of different modalities that we use to interact with each other, ranging from, on the one hand, intimacy in a community or in a family, to capitalism that we use to reach across the world, but that reduces things to commodities and money. And there's this whole spectrum of different ways of interacting in between them. And the goal of plurality is to push out this trade-off, to allow deeper, richer connection across broader ranges of social difference. And the book explores and fleshes out in each of these areas how we can push that frontier backwards. We believe that even though we talk about democracy here, we're not talking just about the public sector. We believe these technologies can transform every part of human life. They can make remote work deeper, more connected, more collaborative. They can make social media prioritize the things that bring us together and build community across difference, rather than atomize us into antagonistic tribes. They can help us protect the environment. They can help us cure diseases and make a more resilient energy grid, and learn in ways that are adaptive to the rich pathways that we need to explore our world and to understand the diverse talents people bring, rather than forcing people into a standard linear educational track. But to do that, we need not just people to go out there and hack, even though that's a critical part of it. We need support from all different sectors of society. We need people to see that they have a choice over their future, and that they can choose through their governments, through their civil organizations, through their organizing, to support a pro-democratic, pro-cooperative, pro-connective and pluralistic vision for technology, rather than just allowing a vision of an overarching AI or a corrosive fragmentation of society to take place. But it requires building networks like the ARPANET for the international age, across digital ministries in different countries, to build digital public infrastructure that builds the foundations of this pluralistic, decentralized, but interconnected society. And people from every sector have to be part of making that happen, because we need that broad public awareness that can be created by art and film. That's why the Oscar-winning director Cynthia Wade was here making a film about Audrey's life for the last week. We need governments and activists to experiment with these practices in the tools they use to organize societies, just like the Colorado legislature did with quadratic voting. We need technology companies like Audrey mentioned to bring this into the way that they develop AI models, like Anthropic did with their collective constitution. And we need to build a research field that connects people across disciplines and to practice to actually build tools that are deployed in the service of this more positive direction of technology. But it's not just in carrying the vision forward that people can collaborate. It's in describing the vision itself, because we believe that every demonstration should be a demonstration. Every protest should be a demo. And so as we tell this story, we are inviting all of you, everyone across the world, to join us and contribute to the building of this book itself, and receive credit and recognition in a variety of ways through the Gov4Git protocol that operates a bit like a blockchain, but without financial incentives, instead with community-based incentives for open source governance, managed by a bunch of the mechanisms that we describe in the book, like quadratic funding, quadratic voting, auctions, etc. And we just released a paper on this, so you can read all about how the protocol works. But it's not just in the writing of the book that we are trying to instantiate the things, in every element of how we do this. So I'll mention one other. The way we're marketing the book as well is organized around plural principles. We're looking for every audience we have to bridge the divides within that audience, to find figures and events that can speak to people across those firewalls in the social network, and then within each of those divisions, people who can speak to each of those areas, so that rather than just ending up in one corner of a social graph, we speak to people and we invite in collaboration across those differences, and we challenge ourselves to incorporate all that difference into the way that we're speaking about this. So I hope many of you will be inspired to participate. We'll talk more later about this. But this QR code will take you to the website and will connect you to the community. Thank you so much, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Glenn, for the sharing. And now we have like 5 to 10 minutes QA time. Is there anybody who wants to have a question?
Hello, Glenn.
Yeah.
I didn't speak English for 10 years, so if I use the wrong words, so please, I love it.
I didn't speak Chinese for 38 years,
Oh,
so.
That's cool. I do read your book, The Radical Market.
Yeah.
Well, I do know a part like gift. In the theory, like cost, yeah. What will you do, or what will you make the rule to things to legacy or to a gift? Yeah, I'm so interested in, because in anthropology.
Inheritance? Is that what you're thinking about?
Yeah, and yes.
Yeah.
Like this legacy is from my grandfather.
Yeah.
And I do want to see what will you do or talk about them. And a gift, will it be deprived or easily be traded by others?
Yeah.
Or you will make another rules for this relationship things?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
No, it's a great question. I think that one aspect, first of all, we already know that legacies of all kinds end up being disrupted by inheritance taxes, by a variety of other things in societies. Harburger taxes make this more continuous over time, but I think that it's a general issue because, of course, nothing lasts forever. But I do think that there are some important limitations to the way we describe Harburger taxes because they don't really think about the value to people other than the current property owner of that persistence. So if you think about Google, the way that Google searches work, the person who, like Macy's doesn't own the term Macy's. But most of the traffic gets directed to Macy's, not because Macy's is owning it, but rather because most people expect that when they search for Macy's, they get directed to the Macy's store and not to JCPenney's or some other competitors. And that's because the Google searches are based on these social signals of what's valuable to the community. And that's missing from most property systems. So I've increasingly come to think that Harburger taxes need to also be supplemented with some way of collectively anchoring sort of what is the value of different things being held in a more continuous way. So I think there needs to be a mixture of Harburger taxes transferring the individual ownership to the commons, but also having that veto on whether something be sold also be partially held by the commons, rather than just by the person who purchases it. So,
thanks for your response.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hey, 现场还有其他人有问题吗？
Hello, thank you, Glenn, for the introduction to Plurality. I'm Tinish, and I'm a reporter with the blog.
Oh, awesome.
So, for protesters, what are some of the real-world cases or examples that they can actually do with Plurality? For example, China had this, white paper movement, right? Protesters were using NFT technology to preserve history. So with this kind of plurality concept, what can protesters do, especially for those in China?
I don't have that much deep knowledge of the specifics of the China example, so let me speak a little bit more broadly to some of the things that I think are important for dissident movements. So one thing we talk about a lot in the book is this notion of plural publics. I think the notion of privacy and publicity are really missing the point of what matters if you want to have a healthy democratic society. Alexis de Tocqueville, the famous admirer of the United States, once wrote that a tyrant is happiest to have people of all sins be an egoist. Because as long as people do not love each other, he's happy for them to hate him. The thing that we need, if you want a thriving democratic dissidence, is for groups to be able to collectively organize outside of the observation of the public, the broader public or the state, not for them to have individual privacy, which actually can reinforce dictatorship and control. And so I'm a big believer that moving beyond a simple public notion of blockchain to the notion of a group of people who can share information and have confidence that information won't be surveilled or shared outside, which requires more sophisticated mechanisms like designated verifier proofs, is a really important direction to move in if you want to have a society with a diversity of protected and collectively organizing groups rather than just public, which is too easy to either be surveilled or be fragmented into individuals who can't cooperate.
Yeah, that's very true. Thank you, Dan.
我们现场还有人有问题吗？是有想要问题？
Hi. I have a question. Like, quadratic voting has been like published and experienced for like 5 or 6 years, and what have we learned about quadratic voting about its like limitations, or like what did well and what didn't do well?
Yeah. So I think, you know, on the positive side, what I would say is I've been quite amazed that modulo some like little user interface issues for some people in some contexts, I think generally almost all the experiences I've heard about with quadratic voting have been pretty positive. That being said, there have been a number of challenges that I think are really important that have been surfaced. One is that if you have people able to coordinate a lot, then groups that can coordinate a lot can dominate often the quadratic voting process. Now, that's also true of other voting systems. This is the famous idea that in democracy, coordinated interests dominate over uncoordinated interests. But I think it can sometimes even be worse under quadratic voting. And trying to account for those social differences has become really the whole reason we went in this direction of plurality rather than just the simple notions in radical markets. We've come to think that this notion of taking into account social organization is really important. Another challenge in Colorado was that they decided to do a secret ballot in Colorado because they were worried about some of these issues of collusion. I think that was a big mistake because it was among members of the legislature, and that contravened public records laws that required transparency in the behavior of legislatures. So I think that was a case where like trying to deal with the collusion type things in a very simplistic way led to a lot of problems. So that's another, I think, important lesson that we've learned. Again, overall, I think, you know, generally people have had great experiences with it, but I think that the challenges that we've had have led us to really exciting innovations in the next generation of voting technologies that are aware of social groups and that account for those in the way that the quadratic function works. So, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I have one follow-up. Yeah. So I think it's interesting you mentioned the secrecy part, because like I think in Ethereum we want to avoid bribing attack. We kind of design Macy to kind of hide the vote. But do you think that kind of secrecy is like harmful or like?
So I think it's the context of Ethereum is very different than the context of a public representative who needs to be able to communicate with her constituents. And at least in theory, you can imagine a world, say, with like liquid democracy on Ethereum, where you might have something that could be transparent to the people who voted for you, but hidden from others. And that might be the ideal information structure. Now, that's not very easy to pull off in the real world, but it might be an interesting direction to go there. I do think that there is a far too simplistic desire of a lot of people in the crypto world to just be like, we'll deal with coercion by making your vote, you know, secret. And I think that just really misses most of what's actually going on in standard voting. In terms of what's actually going on in the Ethereum world, like I'm not knowledgeable enough about how big of a, you know, problem that is or not to make a too strong of a statement. But I think that the notion that like the secret ballot is like an unalloyed good, or that it addresses a really like strong problem that actually exists in modern advanced democracies, or that in countries that have adopted it there aren't bribery problems, is extremely naive. It's based on like a very, very, very simplistic model of what's going on. In Latin America, they have secret ballots all over the place, and there's tons of bribery going on. It doesn't actually require you seeing the person's ballot in order to bribe in most practical cases. And people do mail-in ballots all the time, and there isn't mass-scale voter bribery, even though that can be effectively shown. So I think there's a role for that stuff, but I think that there's like these very simplistic models that a lot of cryptographers like to use because they're clean, that don't actually capture like the essence of what's actually going on in the problem. And I would encourage us to like harness those, but not to get obsessed with them or think that that's like the final solution.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Those are great questions.
Okay, one last question.
Hi, it's good to have you here. My name's Tim Colton. I'm an opinion columnist with Bloomberg Opinion.
Oh, great.
I think a lot of the ideas of plurality, they just make sense, but it's very highbrow for the average human. And so it's similar to a lot of the issues around the crypto space, beyond the kind of currency side of crypto, where there's a lot of really good ideas, really good technology. The average person just can't understand it, and so they dismiss it, and they look at all the failures that have happened. SBF, of course, being most famous. So my question to you is, what could you ask every person in this room to do at a dinner table conversation or over coffee with a casual observer, their Aunt Mary, so to speak? What conversation can they have to help them understand, for example, the key concept plurality, so that they can internalize and understand that it does apply to them?
Yeah.
Because if some of these key ideas are ever going to gain traction, we have to get them into a broader society.
Yeah.
It can't be the geeks like us in this room. So how can people distill it down and have a very simple conversation with a person of above average intelligence so they can internalize it and start spreading the gospel?
I think that's a wonderful question, and here's, it's something we think about a ton. And the way, there's a bunch of different slices on it, and I'll only give a couple, but given the limits of time, but we talk about it much more in the book as well. I think that for every kind of activity, you need an order of magnitude more people doing an activity that's like an order of magnitude less intense to support those people. So my vision is that in 2030, 1 billion people in the non-Chinese speaking world know about Audrey Tang or plurality. 100 million have seen a movie about it, about Audrey Tang's life. Not a narrative story, not about plurality, not about abstract ideas, a narrative story. And plurality shows up the same way the Force shows up in Star Wars. Nobody knows what the Force is. It's just a thing that's floating around, but it's cool. And then 10 million people have consumed an hour or more of media content about the ideas. 1 million people have bought the book or somehow become part of the community in that broad sense. 100,000 have actually digested the material in the book. 10,000 have joined the Discord and are actively contributing. 1,000 feel confident enough about it that they are those messengers going out there speaking, both at the dinner table but also more broadly about the ideas, etc. So I think we need many, many different levels of involvement. We don't just need people who are deep in it and get it all. We need those many structures of reinforcement that understand it at different levels of resolution. And each of those levels, and also subparts of those levels, are going to need different signals to make sense of it. The story of Audrey's life, the story of Taiwan, the story of I'm frustrated with AI and I'm frustrated with all these crypto scams and I want something different, that's something that speaks to people across the lines of political difference in the United States and is very easy to convey. And then, yeah, it has to be some mystical tech thing, but so is AI and so is crypto, and we're used to having those mystical tech things floating around. But as long as you have those links to someone who knows a little bit more, who has links to someone who knows a little bit more, you establish the sort of structure that underpins political movements and so forth, right? And then we also need to be extremely attentive to the lines of political division that create fire breaks in the ability to create those rich structures. So what we do in our thinking about marketing is, again, for every audience we have, we break down what are the fire breaks in the social network, what are the divisions, where, credibility and social capital in one area won't spread to the other. And, at the highest level, we do research, culture, politics, and business, because those are all very different spheres. But then within each of those, we think about what are the divisions within them. Within politics, it'll be like the West and the rest, and then, left, right, and center, and all these sorts of things, right? And so within each of these areas, we attend to the divisions that exist and to seeding in the language that's relevant for that community that credibility and the ability to talk about it. And that's why we believe in translations, not just across language, but across cultural context, about creating a book that has different points of entry, but some people will be really interested in concrete applications and some will be interested in philosophy and so forth. So we need to mirror, to reach that challenge you're saying, the plurality that exists in our account of the world in the way that we communicate the ideas to those publics.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. Thank you for
Thank you. No, it's my pleasure.
好，真的是非常的精彩，刚才的问答的内容也是超出了我的预期。然后我们接下来呢，让我们欢迎Vitalik Buterin 来为我们分享投放新式的态度。
No, thank you so much for that. Fine. Oh, redundant microphones. There we go. Yeah, well, no, it's thank you so much, Glenn. It was a wonderful introduction to plurality and a lot of the ideas that we're here for, and I think a lot of ideas that people in the Ethereum and crypto and Web3 space really hold dear as well. So I thought I would get into some kind of fairly down-to-earth specifics and just talk about voting systems. And I think voting systems are interesting because we normally think about voting as being something that happens at national elections and maybe elections in cities. But it's a process that happens in all kinds of scales at all kinds of contexts, right? So you can have national votes, you can have votes in city governments, you can have opinion polls, and opinion polls are theoretically non-binding and do not directly connect to any kind of outcome, but their results are visible. They influence the discourse, they influence the culture. Then nonprofit organizations have voting processes inside of them all the time. Then we have what I call micro-democracy, so social media platforms. If you think about when someone makes a tweet, or when these days you can tweet on X, you can tweet on Farcaster, you can tweet on Mastodon, lots of different tweeting platforms these days. Then people can people can retweet. And as a user, you see how many times something has been liked or retweeted, and it influences whether or not you see that piece of content, right? So, literally every day we have millions of parallel referendums happening on the question of, is this thing that this person said at this time worth more people seeing or listening to? Then inside of blockchain communities, a lot of different voting use cases. Protocol governance, inside of DAOs, there are votes and many kinds of decisions around upgrades, funding, allocation, all kinds of questions happening all the time, right? So this question of how can we make better voting systems is a question that's really relevant to all kinds of people for all kinds of reasons, right? And it's not even a small thing, right? It's a thing that's actually a pretty significant part of just everything about how we interact with each other. So I think so then, we have voting systems, and voting systems are used in all kinds of ways, right? And like recently, there's a lot of interest in approval voting, quadratic voting, other kinds of voting. So to start off with a kind of technical introduction of like why we even need like fancier forms of voting in the first place, right? Like why isn't it just good enough to just say like, vote for A or vote for B? And if more people vote for A, then A wins, right? Like, what are the kinds of situations in which that fails? So, probably the simplest one is to think about just like a traditional and regular voting system, right? Where, let's say, you have some number of different candidates, and everyone puts out a vote for whoever their favorite candidate is, right? So let's make a simple example here. 9 people are voting, 4 of them prefer A, 3 of them prefer B, 2 of them prefer C. And can anyone guess in a standard vote which one of these would win? A, shout it out. Okay. Now, can you guess which one of these should win? Not necessarily A. So let's imagine that what's actually going on inside of these people's heads is a little more complicated. You have 4 people who are supporters of A, and then they have like some preference between B and C, but honestly it doesn't really matter. They're just supporters of A. And then you have 5 people who really, really hate A. And they have some preference between B and C. Some of them like B more, some of them like C more. But let's say really the difference is not as large, but like the main factor about these 5 people is that they hate A. But even still, if all that you do is you ask these 9 people to just like write down who their favorite candidate is, then you're going to have 4 of them say A, and then the people who hate A are going to be split 50-50 between B and C, and A wins, despite like really it being B that deserves to win. So this is kind of one of these natural examples of a situation where kind of very simple forms of voting break down. And so there's this more general pattern called Duverger's law. And Duverger's law basically says that these kinds of like simple voting systems have this sort of fairly natural outcome where they just collapse down into having 2 parties. And they just like basically turn into a vote between 2 different parties, right? So in the US, like this, it's like very famous that it's happened, right? Like you have Republicans, you have Democrats, and there are the Libertarian Party and there's the Green Party, and like, I met Gary Johnson and he seemed like a nice guy, but like they have no chance, right? And the reason why they have no chance is because, think about the situation like separately from the perspective of each individual voter, right? So what you know is that there's these 2 candidates, and these 2 candidates have historically won, and then there's some new third party. From your point of view, this new third party has a small chance of winning. It hasn't won before. And you might really like them. You might have a strong opinion about it. But by far, like the chance that you'll actually have an impact on that third party winning is just extremely tiny, right? And so the most important thing that your vote does is choosing between the first 2 candidates. And so once you realize that, then you'll start thinking, well, then if the most important thing that I'm doing is choosing between the 2 candidates, you'll choose which one of the 2 is less bad, you'll vote for it, and then every voter separately thinks the same way, and so everyone votes for one of the top 2 candidates, and so like those 2 candidates are kind of locked inside, and every other candidate is locked outside, right? So this is a common pattern, and this makes it very difficult to have kind of elections with more than 2 candidates that are stable, even if the top 2 candidates suck, right? Even if the top 2 candidates suck, there's still this strong incentive to like vote for which one of the 2 sucks less, right? And this is difficult, and like it does make it like very difficult for kind of outsiders to really get into one of these systems. Now, let's talk about ranked choice voting. So there have been some jurisdictions that have been experimenting with some of these kind of more complicated voting systems. So ranked choice voting is one. Ranked choice voting is interesting because it's this kind of complicated contraption where basically every voter just kind of declares their entire order. So they just say, I like A the most, and number 2 I like B, number 3 I like C. And then what happens is that you just go through a number of rounds. During each round, you eliminate whichever candidate gets the fewest first choices. And then once after you do that, then you repeat, and then you keep going until you're down to one candidate, right? So like, let's play this game, right? So here, you check which of the candidates had the fewest first choices, and the answer is C. So now you kick out C. And so now you have a vote between two candidates, A versus B. And then you see that 4 prefer A over B, and then 5 prefer B over A, and so B wins, right? So ranked choice voting, like, it solves this specific problem, but I think the criticism of it is that it becomes very complicated and it kind of overfits to solving this particular problem, right? So there are other kinds of cases where ranked choice voting gives an outcome that is intuitively very wrong, right? So the right. So that's ranked choice voting, right? Basically, the main challenge is kind of this this kind of complexity issue, right? But it still does not solve, and also just it doesn't solve every problem. Now let's talk about a different kind of voting: approval voting. In approval voting, you can vote for whatever number of candidates you want, right? So you can vote for 1 candidate, you can vote for 2, you can vote for 3, you can vote for 0, whatever. So let's say we're back in this world, right? So the world that we're in is this one, where 4 people like A, and then 5 people really hate A, but they have slightly different opinions about whether they like B or C more. So what happens here? Here what happens is basically 4 of them are going to say, I like A, I vote for A, and then 5 of them will just say, well, I'm cool with B and I'm cool with C, and so I'll make 2 votes, right? And then they support B and C. And then the result here actually is going to be that, well, in this case, B and C are both win. They're both tied with 5 votes. And like, if this happens in real life, then like chances are you'll have like some slight differences. Maybe there'll be one guy who really likes B and dislikes C, and then like just one of those 2 will win, right? So in approval voting, like you also get a result that makes sense, but the mechanism is like much simpler than something like ranked choice. Now, a lot of people might have heard of this result called Arrow's theorem. And one sort of like very simple way of describing Arrow's theorem is that if you have a vote where you have at least 3 candidates, then any voting mechanism is guaranteed to have some cases where it just gives a clearly wrong outcome, right? So one of the usually the thing that happens is like it's called violating independence of irrelevant alternatives. Basically, the idea is that if you have like some vote between 2 candidates A and B, then you might have a situation where if you introduce some new candidate C, then like it might that introducing that new candidate might change the outcome of like who wins between A and B, right? And like it's like a very intuitively unfair thing, right? Because it's basically kind of like saying like, you know, if Glenn and I have a wrestling match, then like actually the winner just like depends on whether or not you know, like Puja happens to be somewhere else in the tournament, right? But with Arrow's theorem basically says that no matter how you design a voting system, like you cannot avoid this kind of outcome. But there is a catch, right? Arrow's theorem has this assumption of ordinal preferences, which basically says that the voting system can take into account like the idea that like you like A over B, but it's not allowed to take into account the difference between I like A little bit more than B or I like A lot more than B. Now, once you start making voting systems that are allowed to take that difference into account, then you can sidestep Arrow's theorem and basically the problems go away, right? So approval voting like works because it does this. Then we can talk about quadratic voting, right? So quadratic voting is like basically somewhat more complicated. Basically, you can vote. You have some fixed number of votes. So let's say 100 votes might be, for example, and you might have a system where you can vote multiple times for a candidate or even against a candidate. But if you make n votes for a particular candidate, then it costs you n squared of your voting tokens, right? So your first vote for something is cheap, but then your second vote is more expensive because the cost goes up from 1 to 4. Third vote is even more expensive, fourth vote is even more expensive, and so on, right? And what's interesting about quadratic voting is that it actually encourages basically for people to express not just what preferences they have, but the strength of their preferences. And if you have this kind of situation with 3 candidates, then it encourages you to express the idea that for example, if you really dislike A and you have a tiny opinion between B and C, you can just express that, right? So over here, for example, you might imagine in the exact same scenario, the fans of A are going to vote +8 for A and then -4 for B and C. And if you do the math, 8 squared, 4 squared, 4 squared, add up the 96, less than 100, and they can't really add one more anywhere. And then over here, these guys, if they really hate A, they give -8 to A, and then B and C, they give 5 to one and 3 to the other, right? So they express the idea that they have a bit of a difference in opinion about B and C, but the most important thing is that they dislike A. And if you compute the result, then in this case, A gets -8, B gets 5, and C gets 3, right? So you get the expected result. So the way the quadratic voting, there's this interesting kind of mathematical argument for why quadratic voting is theoretically optimal, which is basically that because the cost of each individual vote kind of goes up linearly, right? So, your first vote costs 1, your second vote costs 3, your third vote costs 5, and so on. Then basically, if you have a stronger preference, then you're going to make more votes, but at some point you're still going to stop, right? If every vote costs the same, then whatever your strongest preference is, you'll make a vote and then you'll keep on making that vote, right? And so if you have a system where you just auction off the outcome of every vote, then what's actually going to happen is it just gets dominated by people who have a lot of money and who have an extreme opinion, right? Quadratic voting does not have that problem. But on the other hand, it still recognizes the difference between I care about something a little bit and I care about something a lot. So the challenge of quadratic funding is that it's also more complicated, right? So with national voting systems, for example, a lot of people are very conservative about the idea of digitizing them, right? Paper ballots are a very understandable technology in terms of people being able to understand why they're secure. With paper ballots, it just becomes super complicated to do the voting, do the counting, and do the whole process once you start doing weird, complicated mathematical formulas like this, right? But at the same time, at least in the short term, right? But at the same time, I think, going back to my original points, right? Voting is not just about national level or even city level elections, right? There's all kinds of places where we have voting, and there's all kinds of places where we even could do more voting if the voting process could be better. So with quadratic funding, actually, in the Ethereum, or quadratic voting, in the Ethereum ecosystem, there's this platform called Gitcoin Grants, which uses a technology called quadratic funding, which is closely related to quadratic voting. It's a very similar principle, where that determines which projects in the Ethereum ecosystem to give grants to, right? And Gitcoin Grants has been running pretty stably for about 4 years now. It's funded a pretty large number of projects. It's been this kind of very stable thing. People understand how it works. People know how to participate, and people have gotten used to the mechanism. And it's actually worked generally pretty successfully, right? So things like quadratic voting, all of these things, they can be applied in all kinds of contexts, and they're being applied in all kinds of contexts, even within the Ethereum ecosystem already. And I think creating these quadratic funding matching pools is even something that local governments could do for specific purposes. Quadratic votes are something that social media platforms can very plausibly incorporate, for example, right? So there's a lot of use cases for these kinds of things. Now, so I think basically where we are now, right, is that there's a lot of these different voting systems that have a lot of these different properties, and I think in a lot of cases, like especially in the short term, the trade-off is basically in kind of how optimal you make something from a theoretical mathematical standpoint versus just like how hard is it to understand and how hard is it to participate for a regular person, right? And I think in different contexts, like you're going to have different answers for that trade-off, right? And so like for certain kinds of things, like like approval voting as an improvement over like regular voting, just like probably is a simple and dumb thing that makes sense to do. But for other contexts, it probably makes sense to do quadratic funding pools, right? Another thing is that like I think like understanding these new kinds of mechanisms is something that like especially for a community of like just like users is something that just takes time, right? And it's something that is more possible than you think, but it is something that does take more time than you think. And like one analogy here that I can use, right, is that like who here knows how to like throw a basketball? Like throw a basketball, get it into a hoop. So every time you throw a basketball, your brain is solving a quadratic equation in your head, right? That's literally what you're doing. Ax squared plus bx plus c, like equals the height of whatever the net is. And like you can do it, and like you actually get a solution that works. Now, so who here can like throw basketballs and hoops reasonably well? Who here remembers that x equals minus b plus minus square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a, right? So you don't actually have to like remember the second to be able to do the first, right? And so I think like realistically, a lot of like when these mechanisms have these kind of more complicated formulas, right? Like you don't even the goal is not for people to become math experts, right? The goal I think is for people to just like get this intuitive, practical understanding of like these are the kinds of properties that the mechanism have. If I participate in this way, these are the consequences that it'll have. And for that to happen, like that's just something that comes with experience, right? And like we saw this with Gitcoin, right? Like when we did the first 5 rounds, like nobody knew what the heck was going on, and then now like it's a known quantity, right? Like you can actually go and look at the previous rounds. You can follow the mechanism. You can see what kinds of things have been happening, right? So trade-off between complexity and power and to kind of just like having a better mechanism is one of those like a challenge, but it's something that can be kind of climbed over time. Another thing also, and like quadratic voting is not the end, right? So Glenn mentioned this briefly, but I think the next frontier in the plurality community in terms of voting systems is kind of going beyond voting systems that just like separately look at individual voters and trying to do these voting systems that do what we're starting to call bridging bonuses, right? This is basically the idea that like you take 2 people's votes into account more if those votes come from 2 people who normally disagree with each other, right? Because if 2 people normally disagree with each other, then that might mean that like they actually have 2 different arguments for believing something, which increases the chance that it's true. It reduces the chance that both of them are like bots that are controlled by like some adversarial governments. Reduces the chance that they're both Kremlin trolls or whatever. It reduces the chance that they both got hacked, right? So no matter in what like if you have 2 accounts that normally have very different behavior, like that in just all kinds of ways, it reduces the chance that you're dealing with what the internet calls like a cloud of NPCs, right? And it basically like that's a stronger signal, and like it takes into account that signal more, and it really tries to like favor things that actually kind of create consensus across already existing divisions, right? I mean, one example of this is the community notes mechanism in Twitter, right? This is something that's really been expanded a lot over the past year and a half. And I mean, I wrote an article about this, right? But it has this mechanism that tries to kind of explicitly favor not just the notes that are like voted up by the most people, but actually the notes that are like voted up by people who normally disagree on like which other notes they've found to be productive, right? And so these kinds of actually Gitcoin quadratic funding has something like this. It's called pairwise matching. but this is another one of those areas that's kind of constantly being researched, right? So there is this ongoing frontier in trying to create these, like better and more powerful voting systems that kind of better capture, like what kinds of things, what kind of information we're actually, like trying to get out of a vote. This is a type of technology that can be applied in, all kinds of contexts, right? And so I think, like this is the reason why, like people are kind of interested in, like democracy and politics, and people have been following crypto and Web3. Like it makes sense for these two to be in the same room, right? Because, these are in a lot of ways ultimately groups that do care about a lot of similar things, and like are dealing with a lot of similar challenges, right? There is a bleeding edge, and I think it's also just very powerful to have a community that is like actively exploring this bleeding edge, right? And like once something gets kind of like improved, worked on, and really tried and tested within like at the bleeding edge enough, then it can be applied across like a whole bunch of other contexts, right? And so I hope that like this is something that people here can be interested in and participate more in at like every level. So thank you. Yeah. Yeah, like a cloud of like it's right. It's like with the internet. Yeah, that's.
我觉得Vitalik的简报做得非常的用心哦。我们那个选举刚结束。
对，就是那个。
对啊，那我们现场有人有想要提问吗？好，
对，就是。
Yeah, thank you for the great session. Our election just wrapped up, so it was very helpful. I may be going a bit off on the tangent here, but I have to ask. So, the US SEC has just approved spot Bitcoin ETFs, right? So, and they actually just delayed Fidelity's spot Ethereum ETF application. So I just want to get your view on a spot Ethereum ETF and how fast you think it gets it, and what crypto space should pay attention to.
I hope they do. I hope they do ETFs for digital monkeys first or something. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Got a troll.
Yeah, I guess I have two questions. One is, I guess within like the sort of like the broader crypto or Ethereum ecosystem, like what voting or like kind of in practice communities or ecosystems, sub-ecosystems have like some kind of voting system implemented that you think is done relatively well. And then I think the second is if there is any, like what kind of evaluation framework do you have for all these different kinds of governance and voting systems?
Yeah, and I think, there's like examples of a lot of these, like floating around, right? Obviously Gitcoin grants that's doing quadratic funding. Then there is, like Optimism retro funding, which is like letting people like provide an ideal amount, and then it's taking a median, and you can like, which is like different from all of the ones that I've talked about, but you can kind of like map it onto them in some way. Then. Obviously, like each individual DAO like has, like yes versus no voting on proposals. So there's like a pretty wide diversity of all of these mechanisms. I think, also want to kind of caution against, like putting too much emphasis on the voting mechanism itself, because I think often it's like 25% is the voting mechanism, and 75% is like the communication structure around the mechanism, right? So, like in the case of like the Optimism vote, for example, there's a lot of effort made to try to support kind of delegation and to support people like being able to describe ahead of time like why they're voting in a particular way, and people could make lists, and other delegates could copy those lists, and like that's a structure that exists on top of the mechanism, but like it also really increases the quality of that mechanism. A lot of these DAOs, like when they vote, they have like governance-related forums. So like those kinds of things really matter a lot as well. And those kinds of things are just also like they're harder to mathematically model. So like you can't just kind of like describe a communication structure and then like tell me what it is, and then like I like go and like compute the derivative of the communication, figure out where it's zero, and like that's like where the optimum, and that's how everyone should talk now, right? Like you can do that with a voting mechanism, you cannot do that with a communication structure. And so I think the only way to do those kinds of, to kind of really get through that is just like active experience. So yeah, and I just like hope to see like more real communities doing experimentation, and like real communities that have needs other than like being enthusiasts of voting systems to try to like do this kind of experimentation. And I think that's like happening more and more already. So I could,
hello, and I have something to ask you. How to avoid or identify the collusion in QV? Because we know, honestly, if someone wants to get 100 votes, and he have to cost 10,000 points, but if he finds another 9 guys, just get 1,000 votes, 1,000 points. It's lower than what he must give. And I believe that will make something harmful things to everyone do not know. Oh, there's underground someone trying to do something.
Yeah.
Everyone just give one vote. Wow, 1 million vote and.
Yeah. So I think there's 2 ways of dealing with collusion. So one of them is to make it harder technologically, right? And this is where XCC in one of his previous questions like mentioned things like Macy, right? Like basically, and what happens, like the easier it is, like if you have a situation where like information about how like just individuals voted is just like out there public by default, then like people are going to use that information in all kinds of ways, right? Like in Gitcoin grants, what happened was that people basically started making like retroactive airdrops to people who participated in quadratic funding, and like if you like from a just kind of like standpoint of like mathematically analyzing the mechanism, that just kind of completely breaks the mechanism, right? Because the mechanism is not built to take into account those kinds of side incentives. But if the information of like who donated how much is like out there, and it's just like that easy to see, then things like that are going to happen. There's also the question of like is there really much of a like an incentive to like actually keep those kind of individual identities safe, right? Because a lot of the time, like even aside from the whole like bribery issue, there's the question of like can you just like go around and like give people $10 in exchange for signing up and giving you their key? And there are ways to try to like deal with this technologically, but then you also have to just like give people some kind of reason to like actually care about that identity. So solving those kind of more technological issues is one part of it, but like even if you do that, you can get like some level of success, but you're never going to be perfect, right? There's like always some like bar that you can't pass. And I think this is part of why it's also important to do the other side of all of this, which is to do to actually design the mechanism in a way where it actually has some of these like bridging bonus mechanisms, right? So that like you give a group of people more weight if they disagree on other things, right? And the reason why that helps is because if someone does like collude and just like directly control, maybe indirectly control a whole bunch of different accounts, then like their power to have a large amount of influence will be very limited, right? Why? Because as soon as they influence the first project, the mechanism will detect that like this is a group of people that vote together, and so their influence over other projects will start like being reduced pretty quickly, right? So I think a combination of both of those strategies is valuable.
Yes, thanks. I see. Thanks.
No.
One last question.
Hi.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I have a question about the new voting method requires a constitution amendment, and amending the constitution requires approval from parliament. Right? However, the parliament usually elected through the old method.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's unlikely to choose a voting system that goes against its own interest. So, is there any chance to break the cycle?
Vitalik,
yes.
Can I weigh in one little factual point?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I mean.
So I believe that in Taiwan that is not the case. So if you read the ROC Constitution additional articles from 1989, it says that the requirement is that the person with the largest number of votes wins. And that is true in approval voting. Whether or not that's true in ranked choice voting is kind of not completely clear. It's definitely true in quadratic voting because there's no requirement in the ROC Constitution about one person, one vote per issue. There is a vague reference to equality. So I actually think whether or not that's true depends precisely on which rule you're talking about and precisely how the Constitution's interpreted. So I just want to be clear about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think like this does depend on context, right? Because like the context that I think about more here is like U.S. elections and how they've collapsed into two parties, right? Like in that, like you can make an argument that like are they going to allow a third party or are they not? And like I think it's like the incentive side of things is like might even be even there like more open than people think, right? Because like even the Republican Party and the Democratic Party internally, like they're not monoliths, they're like complicated collections of people with all kinds of different interests, and that totally include people that might end up like wanting to see some kind of third party also exist, right? So yeah, I mean like the incentive thing is like complicated in any system, and I agree that that's like a big reason for entrenchment anywhere. But yeah, I mean sometimes like the world can be more complicated than it seems, even like in good ways. So there's I mean like sometimes like changes do happen. Yeah, these changes do happen. Yeah. Yeah, changes do happen.
Thank you, everybody, for the sharing. And now
we'll have the last panel discussion with Vitalik, Puja, and Glen as our panelists, and I'll be moderating this panel. Over here? To each side. Okay.
Here, why don't you go over with the intro?
Hey, so good evening, everyone. Evening time now. And welcome to this enlightening panel discussion on the future of technology, society, and governance in the context of our evolving digital world. Today, we are privileged to have three extraordinary visionaries whose work has been instrumental in shaping our understanding of decentralized systems and their impact on society. First, I am thrilled to introduce Vitalik Buterin, a name synonymous with innovation in the blockchain space. Vitalik is the founder of Ethereum, a groundbreaking blockchain platform that's redefined what decentralized networks can achieve. His vision and dedication has been pivotal in the development of blockchain technology and its applications beyond just digital currencies. Next, we have Glen Weyl, a political economist and social technologist known for his profound work on market design and radical solutions to societal inequities. Glen's groundbreaking ideas, particularly the book Radical Markets, have opened new pathways for thinking about democracy, economics, and guided decision-making in the digital age. And joining them is Puja O'Haver, a strategic thinker, a key contributor to the Decentralized Society white paper alongside Vitalik and Glen. Puja's insights into the intersection of technology, policy, and economics are helping to shape a more equitable and participatory future in the digital realm. Tonight's discussion is not just about technology and underpinning decentralized systems, but how these systems intersect with societal structures, governance models, and individual rights. We are at a crucial juncture where the decisions we make and the paths we forge will shape the very fabric of our digital societies. Our panelists will delve into these intricate dynamics and explore how we can navigate this complex and exciting landscape. Without further ado, let's dive into this conversation. So first, we're going to start with Vitalik. In the context of the Decentralized Society white paper, how do you see Ethereum's role evolving in the next decade to support a more plural, equitable digital society?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I've, there's a couple of different ways to think about Ethereum here, right? So you can think about, for example, Ethereum, the technology, and you can think about the Ethereum as a community, and I think both of those have their different roles to play, right? So Ethereum as a technology, it has use cases in implementing a lot of these mechanisms, right? So whether that includes digital identity mechanisms, whether that includes certain certain of voting in some cases, as is already happening in some of these DAOs, whether that's in some of these interesting kind of currency related applications that a lot of people are thinking about, that we haven't talked about them as much today, right? And then there is also the Ethereum community, which is a community that does care about things that go somewhat beyond just things that are centered around the blockchain itself, right? So if you look at zero knowledge proofs, for example, they already have a degree of impact that goes kind of somewhat beyond the blockchain, but obviously the Ethereum community has been completely crucial in actually supporting the development of a lot of that technology. So I think both of those are valuable and have their place, and I hope that a lot of these plurality related ideas end up getting used in the various Ethereum related contexts, which I think they're starting to already, right? So we saw there's Gitcoin grants, there's some of these identity applications around things like Gitcoin Passport, there's ZooPass, there's more and more of these, and especially with zero knowledge proofs, there's a growing kind of effort at interoperability. So a lot of progress happening there, but but I think this is one of these kind of efforts that will inevitably include both a lot of Ethereum projects, but also a lot of things that have been historically outside of Ethereum land, because ultimately the goal here is a goal that really appeals to a lot of people, including people that are far outside the set that have that blockchains have appealed to historically. So I think keeping that connection strong is going to be important as well.
Glenn, considering your work on plurality and your collaboration on the decentralized society paper, what do you see as the most critical societal changes that need to embrace these new technological paradigms?
So I always say that I'm a big believer in a circular theory of action, which is that people come to believe in things because they are taking action to achieve some goal. And then as they come to believe in those things, they're more able to achieve those goals. So I actually think the most important thing the plurality movement can achieve in a decade is mentality change in the world. It's that people believe that democracy will evolve as much as they believe their technology will evolve, that they have a place in their heart for Taiwan and for its transgender digital minister, even if they're conservatives, even if they don't know as many Asian people. But I think that the way we get there is through a feeling of concrete action and achievement that people have. And so we've got to constantly be pushing on both sides of that. We need to be developing a culture and symbols and stories that connect people and uplift them. And those need to be giving people a sense of empowerment and action towards concrete things that they can achieve, that once they achieve them, maybe actually aren't the point in the end, but the ideas that they've gotten through feeling that sense of achievement will push them towards the next achievements and further create that ideation. So that's the reason why I truly believe that you need research, you need culture, you need government, and you need business all doing a part and working together in concerted efforts, because any one of those falling out, short circuits part of that loop, that's really the change that we need.
And Puja, from your perspective, what are the key ethical considerations that developers and researchers should prioritize when building decentralized application platforms?
Probably the key ethical consideration is making sure they're decentralized, right? So what do I mean by decentralization? Because it's a word that we throw around a lot, and it's actually synonymous with plurality in my mind. What are we decentralizing? What we're actually decentralizing is power. But what's power? Power is information and control. And so you take the example of centralization, like authoritarian regimes. What do? They control information, which gives them a greater control over people in a flywheel. More information yields more control over information. But what do we lose in this process? We actually lose informational diversity and plurality, which leads ultimately to risks and collapse. And so decentralizing information control means recognizing where informational differences arise. So informational differences arise in conversation, communities, also in trading and markets. And some things are better at capturing information than others. There are limitations, obviously, to markets and reflecting externalities. Some voting systems, as Vitalik enumerated for us, capture the richness of our preferences and information better than others.
Yeah.
And so building decentralized systems is ultimately pushing power down to where informational differences arise to communities, but at the same time letting communities compose into larger networks to solve these global problems, which are shared problems, and solve them across difference, but doing it in a way where we don't push power to the top and centralize it so it eats up everything below it, but where more power is at the local community, and yet there's still power for global coordination, but less. So from the perspective of ethics, usually questions around ethics are around making informed decisions and informed consent. And when you think about power in this networked conception, but fundamentally where communities have more power and they compose into richer networks, we get this conception of networked consent, networked informed consent, where you have, when you make decisions at a local level, right, you have information and you can make informed decisions, but also when you make decisions as a part of something that is bigger than yourself, as part of a network, the network also integrates the information across all layers and across informational minorities, and that's how we achieve ethical decentralization.
Let me follow up with one more question for you. So, how do you see the role of community-driven governance evolving in the context of decentralized societies, and what are the implications for traditional models of democracy?
So, I think community governance is key. And in a lot of ways, experiments in democracy have forgotten about community governance. So like, you see, very simplistic experiments in one person, one vote. But is democracy just one person, one vote? And if you actually go back, so I'm American, you go back to the Federalist Papers and James Madison, he wasn't actually really concerned about one person, one vote. He was concerned about the problem of faction and groups. And what are community groups but communities, right? So representing groups and communities is key to actually functioning democracies and capturing, as Vitalik was saying, bridging bonuses, enabling groups that are generally maybe don't agree, but then suddenly agree on something that should be more elevated, that's much more interesting to the polity. And that's actually probably a more stable configuration for any level of social coordination, democracy. And I just want to say, like, democracy isn't something that just happens at one level, it happens at many levels. Like, families, can also be very democratic. When I make decisions, it's not me making decisions for the whole family or say my husband or my son, but we have a compromise. And we recognize that, my son's, informational environment is different from ours, and we reconcile these differences and we achieve kind of informally consensus across difference. And communities can do this too, and in fact, if we can kind of instantiate and experiment this norm of valuing consensus across difference and valuing informational uniqueness, it will allow us to actually experiment at larger scales, not just at the level of nation states, but even networks, right? Because they're networks that are much bigger than nation states that influence our behavior and risk kind of vertically integrating our information, leading to kind of singularity at worst or oligopoly, right, is the second best. Did I answer your question?
Yep. Can I add one thing to what Puja said? So I'd also commenting on what Vitalik said about sort of how the voting mechanism is just one part of the process in all these things. The reason why we have that whole spectrum of plurality there is precisely for that reason. It's very easy to get obsessed with voting or with markets or with, how we talk on social media, and all these are important, but they're all interlocking modalities that together play roles in structuring how a democratic, pluralistic society exists at many different scales of organization. And we can't just push on one of these and forget the others without falling into a dystopia. We need to improve intimacy to have a strong democracy just as much as we need to improve markets. And they complement each other. So it's really important to always see the role of each technology and also the limits that are complemented by other parts of that spectrum.
So Glenn, in your view, what are the biggest hurdles in translating theoretical concepts of decentralized governance into practical scale solutions here?
I think that there are interlocking problems. There's a problem of culture and ideation, because you can't really make change that's for the people and by the people unless the people are aware and have some understanding of what's going on. And the only way to bring that, as a questioner earlier asked, is not through intellectual things, but through cultural phenomena, because otherwise people can't be included, can't be networked in to the process, because the intellectual side is not going to be everyone's entry point. So that's a huge challenge that we put a lot of emphasis on. But cultural things always point to more concrete technological and research things. So there needs to be a research community. There needs to be concrete technologies that people can believe in to support those cultures. And so I think it's just very important that we see all these things in sort of like one of those networked diagrams, and are constantly attending to sort of which ones are in the green, which ones are yellow, and which ones are red, and attending to the ones that are red, rather than being just obsessed with one of them, and always seeking out the people who balance that set of needs that the community has, just like I was showing on that sort of pluralistic marketing sheet.
Would you like to add?
I don't know. Yeah, I'm okay. Yeah.
Then, might as well ask you another question here. Could you elaborate on challenges and opportunities you foresee in balancing decentralization with regulatory compliance, and especially in the financial domain?
That's like a super broad question, and I feel like it has like different answers in like about 10 different fields, right? So like in the case of privacy, for example, I wrote that co-wrote that privacy pools paper that came out a few months ago, which I like highly encourage people to look up and read. That like talks about some like interesting new approaches around like how to do like privacy systems that kind of minimize bad actors' ability to participate. Then like another example of like like a regulatory hot topic is like token sales and ICOs, and there's like an entire set of questions of like what is a version, like what is a subset of that design space that kind of captures a lot of the benefits, which I do think are like large, and the space is definitely missing now, but like at the same time minimizing the risks. Then like you have like in just all kinds of individual issues, and like you can talk about stable coins, like you can talk about like minimizing risks in centralized exchanges, and there's some like interesting zero knowledge proof based ways of doing that. So yeah, and I think this is one of those cases where kind of the answer just has to be plural because the question is plural.
Just to build on that and to sort of illustrate the point I was making before in relation to one of the things Vitalik mentioned.
Yeah.
So privacy pools paper, great paper, really great thought. At the same time, these privacy pools, the idea is you get a group of people together, they kind of monitor each other in some way, and then you make sure that there aren't bad actors within that pool, and otherwise the whole pool is going to get punished or something like that. I mean, that's roughly the idea. Like, fascinating concept, right? It's got an element of collective punishment, but I'm actually kind of happy with that in certain ways. But the thing is that, that's a very limited technical idea. And actually what has to happen is you need to form communities of people with trust and a sense of monitoring. And there has to be all kinds of mechanisms for them to actually invade each other's privacy and form a collective notion of privacy, and then be protected from others. And that requires all sorts of community, all sorts of communication. So the point is that, interesting idea, cool mechanism, very important, very consistent with plurality, and yet what's needed for it, like the technology is like 3% of it. Even among the technologies that are part of it, probably the actual privacy pool part, as opposed to like how does the community monitor itself without that then spilling to the state and blah blah blah, is like an order of magnitude bigger of a part of it than like just the privacy pool part of it itself. So there's so many social and cultural and business and organizational elements to making something like that work. So that's why I think it's so important that we keep the technology in mind, but also keep all those other aspects in mind and pivot to them and have them interoperate with each other if these things are actually going to work.
Yeah, I can add on to that. So the question broadly was around compliance, right? So, there's a whole regulatory regime like securities regulation, antitrust regulation, that was built for an analog world, basically, right? And the purposes of these regulatory regimes broadly are to correct for information asymmetries, right? And so in securities regulation, that's supposed to, encourage healthy capital formation in markets, right? In antitrust, it's to prevent domination of one actor. But as we actually enter this greater networked age, these objectives end up overlapping and conflicting in very strange ways that, the regulatory apparatus is not able to deal with. One of the interesting things about building pluralistic and decentralized systems, and in particularly relational identity and social identity that we talked about in DSOC, is it actually opens up an opportunity and a space for coming up with, bottom-up mechanisms and community-driven mechanisms to deal with these information asymmetries in actually a much richer way. And so for example, the idea of plural voting and bridging bonuses, what that does is it actually, if you use it as an attention mechanism, what's revealed to you is information that is socially distant or more adversarial. And so when you're actually making a decision to do something, nobody reads the nobody has time to read the boilerplate. And I actually was like joking, like we're gonna have some instantiation with like, ChatGPT, where you just have the endless boilerplate information disclosure that just never stops and keeps updating. Right? Nobody has the attention to do that. What you actually want to know is, given any set of circumstances, what are like my adversaries? What are people who are very informationally different from me thinking about this particular commodity or token or asset or even politically? And that's what's relevant to me, right? And so I can actually make decision making much faster, easier, and more efficient, and allow us to integrate information much more efficiently across distance. And this is really important for capital markets and capital formation and credit markets, which, the 8K and annual disclosures and SECs, all of that can be radically transformed to something much more profound and richer, and yet easier and simpler and legible and more legitimate than what it is today.
Vitalik, I've heard you mention zero knowledge quite a bit. To those most people out there, it's quite a mystery. Could you kind of explain what zero knowledge proof is, and in the context of decentralized societies in plurality, what kind of potential can zero knowledge technology play?
Sure. What a zero knowledge proof most fundamentally is it's a way of proving something about a piece of information that you have without actually revealing that information, right? So I wanted to just give one interesting example of this. Click. So this is a piece of software called ZooPass, which was prototyped and built over the course of last year. And over here inside of this QR code, this QR code is a zero knowledge proof. And what it proves is that I am one of the, roughly, I think 1 to 200 people who had the right to enter the Ethereum Foundation co-working space at DevConnect in Istanbul last year because, as an Ethereum Foundation person. And it proves this without revealing which Ethereum Foundation person I am, right? So it proves that I'm a member without revealing which member I am. Now, this is the offline version of this. There's also an online version that does the same thing. The way that works is you use a zero knowledge proof to log in, right? So there's these entire applications where you could log in with a ZooPass. So if you're a member of a particular group, you get the ability to log in and without revealing which member you are, right? And then there's a system called ZooPoll where anyone can propose polls, anyone can vote in polls, and so you can even vote, and the votes simultaneously, keep the information of who you are private, right? So they don't reveal the identity of the voter, but they also ensure that the voter, they create a proof that you actually are one of the members of the group, and that you are only making a vote once in that particular poll, right? So they're revealing exactly the information that you need to be sure that the vote is being done correctly, but at the same time, you're not revealing anything else that compromises your privacy, right? Now, there's a lot of different ways to try to apply this technology, right? And so, to try to give one example that kind of goes into some of Glen's more sophisticated ideas of privacy. You could even do things where you publish a proof, and then along with that proof, you publish some encrypted information where that encrypted information is only visible to people who have a key that's within a particular group. And then you also prove that the data inside the proof that the data that you're encrypting actually is kind of the data that you're supposed to be revealing according to whatever the rules of that system are, right? So zero knowledge proofs are powerful because they make privacy programmable. They let you choose in a very fine-grained way which things that you're proving and which things you're revealing. So they're this very powerful kind of brick for digital and cryptographic structures that try to protect privacy and security of information in a way that kind of really lets you fine-tune those properties. So very powerful tool, lots of use cases in privacy, also lots of use cases in scalability, and including things like ZK rollups and validiums and so forth. So you'll be hearing the term a lot more over the next decade.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask general questions for all you take on. In your white paper, you touched on the importance of digital identity in decentralized society. How do you envision the evolution of digital identity, and what are potential pitfalls and promises?
So I think it's a multifaceted question, but a quick response is there's this this actually gets to the decentralization point made earlier. There's this tendency to think that, okay, I can find this one solution or represent identity in like one way, you know, whether it be through like, you know, a retinal scan or a scan or something, or some kind of validation ceremony, and then like scale that across the globe, right? And there's, you know, that there's always economies of scale to human coordination, and in any particular game, right? And so I think what we want is a plurality and diversity of games, and actually we want those games to be, and representing identity to be kind of as locally contextualized as possible. And we kind of want to avoid this tendency to be like, okay, I'm going to find a mechanism across the globe and then put all of your eggs in that one basket, because there inevitably will be some group of actors who are more sophisticated and will start, you know, people will form groups, that's politics naturally, and form communities, and then we're sort of back at square one. You know, we have also these problems around like bribery, which like Vitalik was mentioning. So I think emphasis in these kind of identity, expression of identity and social identity, and representing your membership to groups, encouraging a plurality and diversity of experiments and rather than trying to create like a single platform for the globe for everybody is my advice.
Yeah, I would strongly agree with what Puja says, and I think the key thing to avoid that is to have interoperability, not for the purposes of homogenization, but for the purposes of diversification. What you actually want, so like, let me give Gitcoin Passport as an example. You know, despite being kind of loosely in the Web3 world, I am not like Web3 native. I'm not particularly into like various kinds of gambling or like this does not excite me, you know. And there's just like not actually that much to do in the Web3 world as a practical matter that doesn't involve that these days. You don't actually have much activity on these things unless you're doing a fair bit of that kind of thing. And so, you know, I tried to get into Gitcoin Passport. But the reality is, unless you have like years and years of like doing lots of like kind of wacky financial transactions in Web3 land, you can't really get validated on Gitcoin Passport. Now, why is that? Well, I have lots of proofs of my identity. I have all kinds of government issued stuff. I've got all kinds of accounts in, you know, Web 2 world. And it should be possible to have me give permission and transfer those things into Gitcoin Passport. Now, why doesn't that happen? Because there's all kinds of ways in which those services have made it hard for me to share relevant data that I want to share with Gitcoin, and then for them to process it in a meaningful way. And so, you know, I really strongly believe that just taking like a private sector will hack it, will break free type attitude is not going to get you to a point where you can actually have pluralistic participation in these things. You need forced interoperability rules from governments. You need, you need regulations that require monopolistic companies to enable people to port their data if they want to other services under the right kinds of. And we have that with telephone numbers, right? That has not solved the problem of competition in telephones, but it's certainly reduced a lot of the tendency to lock in that could otherwise exist. So you need to have antitrust interventions that do things like that. You need regulatory systems that lean towards, you know, common standards. You need governments to adopt, for their own use, things that push towards those common standards. You need all kinds of mechanisms together, because otherwise you just have your new shiny thing supposed to interoperate with everything, but then it doesn't interoperate with any of the things that people are actually using, and you create your own closed community rather than actually building bridges to the other ones. The internet was supposed to be a network of networks. That is the idea. It is not, we're going to build the new network that is the network of networks. No, it's that we're actually going to take the things that exist, and through a combination of bottom-up effort, of standardization processes,
of government interventions, of all kinds of different things. We're going to build that interoperability so that genuinely people can bring wherever they're coming from to this joint space that we're creating. So I think that will be critical, because we do have all kinds of identity signals out there. If you look at your physical wallet, you have all kinds of membership cards of different small businesses, of different civic organizations, you have credit cards. Like, we need to have a way to bring all those signals to bear on these things that we're trying to build, or it's not actually going to be a realistic environment.
One final question for the panelists here before we open to the floor questions. What are your thoughts on the role of academia in development and governance of decentralized technologies, and how can academic institutions contribute to this evolving landscape?
Take this one. I'm super excited about academia. So I think the next big unlock for use cases in Web3 is through relational or social identity. But at the same time, there's all kinds of privacy concerns and considerations. But academia has this wonderful feature of being a completely status-driven and public enterprise. As an academic, you want to show your work and flaunt your status. And there is this intrinsic identity system and hierarchy that's very rigid. And the stakes are low, the conflicts are high. So bridging bonuses are like, prime and ready to go. And yet, at the same time, academia is so wildly inefficient, right? And we know from science of science research that actually intersectional research across different groups is research that tends to be more innovative and breakthrough, and we want more innovation. So I think we could take, academia as a starting point for experiments in relational identity, and actually accelerate breakthrough innovation, and at the same time break the sort of internal divisions and reapportion influence based off of also how well you predict, right? Because in academia, you come in as a postdoc and you kind of have to work your way up the ladder, right, in order to have influence. But with these relational identity experiments, we can actually use layer and peer prediction mechanisms and start to actually reward influence based off of how well you are good at predicting breakthrough innovation, which is actually what we really care about with academia, right? That's what we want out of research institutions, are more innovations and more scientific truths about the world. And so that's one of my pet things, and I'm always trying to find ways to see these experiments within the DeSci community. And I also think it's a great place to also foster more thinking about plural mechanisms, plural innovation, and plural voting, and bridging bonuses, and quadratic voting, and amongst an audience that will have a lot of incentive and a lot of time to digest and further advance these mechanisms, because as Vitalik and Bud said earlier, there's no terminal end state here, right? These systems will keep evolving, voting will keep evolving, and what we need to do is just have a broader audience thinking about and invested in these mechanisms and continuing to develop them.
They say the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, and I think Puja, not being an academic, maybe thinks academia is a little bit more exciting than I, having been an academic, came to feel it was, and therefore left. That being said, I actually think what academia, there's two failure modes here. There's the standard DeSci thing, which is not quite what Puja's talking about, but it is good dominates the field, where it's kind of let's turn into a stock, like every research thing. Let's bet on stuff, And I think that's pretty dumb, because I think it ignores all the incentives that exist within the academy, and the fact that betting on shit is already something that a lot of society does in lots of places, and has lots of failure modes itself. But academia is also incredibly crusty and disconnected from reality, and massive amounts of money going into research in ways that are totally beside the point, given that so much is open source software. And so the key thing, and I think this is actually what Puja's doing, so coming back to be positive on what she was saying, is you got to connect those things. You got to take seriously the structure of the academic fields. You can't just ignore it.
and like go out there and like ignore all the money that's going in. And at the same time, we have to say, well, this is really messed up. And there's other logics that we could bring to bear on this. And you've got to hybridize in really interesting ways. And I think those are the types of experiments that Puja's doing with these, bridging bonuses and, getting different fields together and subsidizing that and whatever. And I think that's super cool. And I think there's a real chance of that making a difference, especially if, significant resources are put into it. So.
Just want to clarify for a second. So there's a reason why I didn't become an academic. I'm very well aware of the stance that you're making up. And I do agree, it's precisely because it's this ossified, crusty institution that just so inefficiently allocates money. And so in the same way, like radical markets combined, the best of markets with the best of voting, I think there's a way in which academia can be a little bit more firm-like and efficient and innovative, kind of like startups. And these mechanisms, these plural mechanisms that we talk about, can do that and transform an institution that is kind of just like a really negative experience into one that's a very positive, some super modular one.
And by the way, we have precedent for this. Academia gave us the internet, but it gave us the internet because the Department of Defense in the United States gave it a giant kick in the pants through J.C.R. Licklider, who created the field of computer science by seeding the first computer science departments, connecting people across fields and building something that became the internet. So this can happen, but it takes real attempt to invest and do that bridging and so forth. That's how you get real breakthrough innovation.
Yeah, I mean, I also just want to say the boring thing, which is that lots of academic researchers have already played very valuable roles in helping the all of these technologies, whether it's Ethereum consensus research or zk snark related stuff or voting mechanisms. And so just all kinds of very productive collaboration is just kind of passively happening within with each and every passing month. And I think that's also just worth celebrating and continuing to foster.
I think I recall that Vitalik, you were involved in decentralized science, right? Do you think there's any clash with how the evolution of DeSci may with academia?
I think it depends. I mean, I know there's people in academia that are very interested in DeSci, so I think there's lots of ways that could play out.
All right, so we're now open to the floor for any questions. Anyone?
And to Glen, I have something to ask you. And now we know the radical markets, the cost is cool. Do you think that's be possible for the cost running for a decade or 15 years? Next, you will need a Mod 2 and Mod 3 and get a cycle. I believe it's a possible way to work in this economic market in a society. Yeah.
Might I ask that you say the question in Mandarin and someone translate it because I didn't quite catch it.
然后 Andrew 再协助翻译一下。Sure. 可以。
好，谢谢各位。就是因为我看到了那个激进市场，其实我觉得非常有可能有落实的机会。但是为了让它能实现在现实中，那我觉得它在运行的情况下，可能可以运行个15年、20年。但是在这种激烈的运作中，它可能会需要一段可能经济喘息或者是一种调节 adjusting 的那个时间。我觉得如果我们将这种cost 定义为 Model 1，那可能会有一种变体或者是变形，可能会有一个 Model 2和 Model 3，可能也是 cost， 但是会有一些细节或者是模式上不同，那去制造一个经济上的这个 cycle， 就是周期，让这个方式可以运用在不管是一个 tribe， 不管是一个 nation 或者是不同的 kingdom 都可以运行。对，我好奇是有没有相关的想法？至少我觉得这是可以讨论的。
Sorry, I just got a bit.
So, in essence, what are the phases of hurdles that the society may experience as they adopt the principles, some of the principles of that markets?
It depends on which ideas you're talking about. It sounds like you were talking about cost in particular. There are so many both interesting ideas in radical markets and also things that are very incompletely developed. So I'll just give you one example. Who does the cost revenue go to? So think about the land in the Bay Area, one of the most expensive places in the world. Does that land belong to the city of San Francisco collectively? Probably not, because the software industry wasn't even really based in the city of San Francisco at most of the time of the development. Does it go to Stanford University? Well, I mean, they contributed a lot, but clearly it's a much broader phenomenon than just one university. Does it go to the global software industry? Who would even represent that? So, the observation that property should not be private is really a starting point. And where one goes with that is actually very complicated. Because actually individuals are themselves part of a bunch of different communities, and there might be some ways in which individual ownership might actually capture the diversity of communities involved better than just giving it to San Francisco. So I've come to think that some of the ideas were very creative, but they also were just starting to gesture towards the real answers here. And the same thing can be said about quadratic voting, which was very individualistic, and now we were talking about more plural forms of that. So there is so much more work to be done to actually figure out what a network society looks like. And all these things are groping experiments towards sketching that out. They're not complete answers.
Just suggest that revenue should go into a matching fund for bridging bonuses, right?
Well, where, within what community?
Well, right.
I totally
it just
agree.
depends on your scale.
For sure you're right about that, but the question is within what community should you do that? So there are so many interesting questions.
We'll take one more question, no problem. Last one. Anybody? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. I just want to continue the conversation we had in the room. Like you said, current macroeconomics model suffer from some issues from bad tails and tail events, but does it mean all the modern macro development models are worthless or less interesting or irrelevant?
I mean, what I would say about that is that, modern macro models probably have about as much relevance to the behavior of the economy as Newtonian physics has to the behavior of an airplane, which is to say, clearly some rules are at some level of abstraction in some way at play, but probably fluid dynamics is going to tell you more, which is 7 layers of complexity and abstraction built on top of underlying Newtonian mechanics. And so I think that there are kind of so many ways in which what's captured by economics is some incredibly tiny slice that might describe some limited dynamics within some part of the system, but does it really capture overall how things are working? I'm pretty skeptical of that. And I mean, just to give you one illustration of that, we all know that increasing returns are incredibly important. There's all these Nobel Prizes given out for it, and yet the basic model that is supposed to be
underlying the whole economy since everything's a private good and all things have decreasing returns. So given the decreasing returns we know are responsible for sort of like all technological progress, all reason that you have any firms of any scale in the economy. But what is the relevance of a model that abstracts from all of that? I mean, something. It has something to do with something, maybe somewhere under very limited circumstances, but like, does that describe what's actually happening in the economy? Or like get us anywhere close to like a description of like the best possible way you could arrange the economy? Seems pretty unlikely to me, so, yeah.
Thanks for the clarification.
So we'll be doing a lightning talk session where attendees here can share their takeaway from Plurality Salon. Tonight, would anyone like to, Tim, would you like to share us a takeaway here?
No.
You're good? Okay. All right, everything's cool? Okay, all right. Anybody want to share a takeaway from
其实我有问题想要问Vitalik， 对，就是回到刚刚 Vitalik 你刚刚讲的投票的机制，the voting system，do you think is there any possibility for any government like use the most effective voting system for their president election or like national election? And if yes, what kind of difficulty they will meet? If not, what kind of difficulty they cannot pass?
Sorry, is this about quadratic voting systems or like, yeah?
The voting system for like national
Right.
election?
You mean, sorry, like, is the question about like changing voting systems in general or like some specific one?
Like changing voting system in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the answer to that just like depends so much on the local context, right? It's like the challenge is always, like what are the interests of, like whatever the like existing incumbents are. Yeah, like that's just like a really challenging one to deal with, right? Like figuring out how to do it in a way where like just people like everyone feels like they benefit, as opposed to like the change in institutions just kind of at the same time being an act of like one side doing something to go against like all of the other sides, is generally like one, I think, good thing to always keep in mind. But yeah, I mean, I think beyond like, and then the other piece that I talked about a lot, right, is just kind of understandability of a mechanism, like especially if you try to go into something that's like new and fancy and complicated, there's the question of like, will people even understand it? Are people comfortable with it? Which is why I think with all of these things, like it's always good to just like start at small scale and then like apply it in more and more places over time. So I think like those are some of the important considerations, and then beyond that, it just like depends a lot on specifics.
Okay, all right, so we're going to conclude Plurality Salon with Glenn's call to action, and we'll be inviting Jackie to show us how to become a contributor.
Hi everyone. Do you have my slides? Yeah, okay. Want to say okay? So my name is Jackie. I'm one of the contributors on the Plurality team.
Maybe the first contributor. Yeah, he's really the person who got so much of this going. So thank you.
Thank you. So I helped set up the Discord for contributors and helped set up the forking translation processes for all the different languages, people to translate the Plurality book. And what happened was actually 2 years ago, I cold emailed Glenn, inviting him to come to Taipei. He said no.
but I did come. I just wanted to
He said no, but I started a wonderful relationship where when the book first launched, we helped translate. We got a group of people here Vivian, Greg, Giselle, a group of people from GovZero, all this community in Taiwan to help translate the outline of the book, the announcement, and that started a wonderful contributor group, contributing to Plurality. So today I want to share about one goal today is convert as many of you guys into contributors to the Plurality movement. And we have a lot of things that we're working on that we need help with. So yeah, we heard a lot of wonderful ideas today. Thank you, TempoX, and all the wonderful speakers for having us. And for this part, I want us to take action. So I want as many of us to become contributors. So I'm going to share about what we're working on and how you can help. So we have a website that we're working on, plurality.net. And we also have a bunch of translation forks of different communities that's also translated the book into Korean, Japanese, even simplified Chinese. There's also a translation fork going on. There's Russian, Ukrainian, and German, and of course Mandarin Chinese. We'll keep scrolling down. And we also want to invite people to help write more of the content. So we actually need a lot of help from people. We have a wonderful team of contributors. Aki, Tofu, some of them are not here, but if you're a contributor here already, can you raise your hand or stand up so we can see you? Can we get a round of applause for these contributors? Okay, so there's a wonderful group of us, but we love more help. We need help in engineering the website. We can use some help in designs. Keep scrolling. We know people in different countries who are interested in contributing to the movement. We need more translators. And of course, we need more content writers, specifically for the Uri-san chapter that we'll talk more about. And then if you're interested in helping with social media and spreading the image, spreading the gospel, we're also welcome to help. And if you go to plurality.net, chapter 3, there's a chapter specifically about the context of Taiwan. And so what a lot of people talk about today, how Taiwan has been such a vibrant and important part of this plurality movement and digital democracy. We need people here who's been in Taiwan to add to the story, add to the narrative, add the history of things you've gone through, people who's been part of 318, part of Taiwanhua, part of Be Taiwan, part of all these movements that we had in Taiwan. So, I know we have some journalist friends here, so anyone who wants to contribute and write the Taiwan story as part of the Plurality book, we'd love for you to join us. And there's Mandarin, there's English, so whatever language you're comfortable with, they're both the root language. If you keep scrolling. Yeah, so chapter 3, the Uri-san, keep going. So how do you join and how do you contribute, right? So we have a Discord for the contributors. As you can see, can you zoom out a little bit? Yeah, so there's a section for the public, channel for contributors. If you keep scrolling. So, it's really easy. First, just join the Discord, introduce yourself, tell us about your experience, what you want to help with. And for writers, it's also very easy. You just go on GitHub, you fork the repository locally or make a fork remotely, and then you write the content, make your add edits, and you can simply make a pull request. And all the instructions are in the Discord, so it's super straightforward. Keep scrolling. Keep going. Yes, here's how you make a pull request. Keep going. Yeah, so there's supposed to be a QR code. Oh, okay, so yeah, come in here, introduce yourself in the intro channel. There's a bunch of resources that you can look at. If you wanted to contribute to a translation, there's a whole translation forum to join. And then any feedback on the website or on the content, there's also a feedback channel. And if you keep scrolling, there's a huge QR code for everyone to scan and join the Discord. Is it there? No? What happened? Wait. So yeah, join our Discord and become a contributor and help spread the Taiwan narrative.
Everyone who contributes will get recognized in a variety of ways. You'll get social capital tokens within the Plurality community. Those will entitle you to GitHub discounts, to getting your cover on the book, depending on what you do, to name on the cover of the book, picture on the cover of the book, name in the credits, ability to shape the future of the community, all this sort of stuff. So please join us. Please join us and help in any way that you feel called to.
And if you don't see the way that you feel called to contribute in any of these things, tell us what we're missing. Because we know that we don't know, and we know that you can tell us. So thank you.
And remember, we do a Slido at first, at the beginning of our event. We have a question. We still have one question. There's one said, could AI be utilized in new ways to recognize and eliminate scammers? So, Glenn, sorry, we have one more question. Yeah. They said, could AI be utilized in new ways to recognize and eliminate scammers?
I'm going to let Vitalik answer that if he wants to. Vitalik, do you want to answer that question?
What's the question?
Can AI be used to eliminate scams?
I think this is one of those. Yeah, I think this is one of those cases where the answer is yes and no, right? I think in terms of eliminating scams, one thing that I believe in is that I think there need to be actors, sophisticated actors whose incentives are really aligned with the user in order to help people surface the information about what might be a scam and what might not be, right? So, in the Ethereum case, for example, I'm happy to see that wallets are starting to become more sophisticated and really participate more actively in that those things. And I think AI definitely has the role to play in those things because the way that AI works is it's always very far from perfect, but it can it does do a good job of matching patterns and automatically discovering a lot of different kinds of things. So I think there's a combination of some kind of just basic static filters and tools that can better show the user what's actually going on and try before they interact with it. AI, one particular use case is just translating what is going on in smart contract simulation into natural language. So I think there's a lot of use cases like that, but I think one specific portion of that makes sense to discover through experience.
Thank you. Okay, so we are now facing the end of our salon, and if you wanna get today's information, we have transcript of our speech, and we will upload it to our Telegram group. And also is group photo time. 大家，我们活动今天圆满告一个段落，让我们用最热烈的掌声。那谢谢 Glen、Vitalik， 还有 Puja， 还有 Andrew， 还有谢谢在场各位的参与。那我们日后呢，每个月都会举办固定的线下的沙龙，那欢迎各位先加入到我们群组，然后关注接下来的资讯。那接下来就是我们的 group photo 的时间。那我们以这个当做背景，我们一起移动到前面来，然后摄影师的话可以帮我在这个方向，然后拍过来吗 ？OK， 谢谢。好，了解。然后工作人员可以帮我把前2排椅子撤掉，谢谢。 我们站这两排，各站这两排，然后让这个题目在中间。